Dr. Michael Cusumano is the SMR Distinguished Professor of Management at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He specializes in strategy, product development, and entrepreneurship in computer software, as well as automobiles and consumer electronics. At MIT, he has recently taught a course entitled Platform Strategy and Entrepreneurship, and you have a book by the same name, or a similar name, as well as Strategy and the CEO. He's consulted and lectured for approximately 100 companies and organizations, including NASA and World Bank. He is currently a director of Oryx Corporation in Japan, a country where he's done much work. We met through his work with the MIT REAP program, Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program, which engages with communities around the world to strengthen innovation-driven entrepreneurial ecosystems and transform economies. He's published 14 books, including the book that we'll talk about today that he wrote with David Yoffie and published in 2015, Strategy Rules, 5 Timeless Lessons from Bill Gates, Andy Grove, and Steve Jobs. The book has been translated into 18 languages and received wide media coverage from CNBC, Bloomberg News, The New York Times, The Economist, The Financial Times, Fast Company, and other media outlets. We're starting a series of podcasts inspired by the case study of Steve Jobs that I did, of Apple and Pixar fame, of course. Jobs' work exemplifies Ethic 5, Be the Real You. This is the authenticity orientation of entrepreneurship. Michael, good to see you, and thank you for being with us.
Okay, great to see you again, Kevin.
So what's the origin story on the book before we dive in? Why Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and Andy Grove?
So the story is that my colleague David Yoffie from Harvard Business School and we've been colleagues since roughly 1984, and our careers have closely paralleled these three guys in many ways. But the particular event was when Steve Jobs was dying. This was roughly September, October of 2011. And I had been working on a sequel to my platform leadership book, had just started, but David called me up and said, Mike, Steve's going to pass away. We've written about him, about Bill Gates and Andy Grove. Bill's retired, Andy's retired. This is a good time to reflect on what we've learned from these three guys. And there's no one in the world who really has followed these three guys and their companies more closely than he and I. So I agreed with that. And by a strange coincidence, I at that time was already starting to write a little article called The Legacy of Steve Jobs, where I changed my opinion on him. I had been pretty critical of Steve over decades, basically saying he doesn't understand platforms, and he's building products in a platform industry, and that's why the Mac struggled with 2% market share for so many years, et cetera. But he finally got it with the iPhone, and just before that, the iPod. But there was a lot of stories behind it, and we wanted to kind of dig deeper into what those stories were.
And I may not be remembering this correctly, but the picture that you have on the book of the three of the individuals, I think was taken in 1998. And am I remembering correctly? And you saying that was the only time they were photographed together?
The only photograph of them together. This was a Time magazine Man of the Year celebration event. Andy Grove had been named Time Man of the Year. I think it was March 1998. And Bill Gates had been Man of the Year a couple years before, and Steve Jobs was never named Man of the Year, but he was on the cover of Time magazine several times. So they were all invited to the party. They were all in tuxedos, and it was the three of them together, and a wonderful picture. And it was hanging on Andy's wall. And when David and I were interviewing Andy in his office for this book, I saw the picture and said, I want that for the cover of the book. And so Andy's assistant gave us a copy of it.
Oh, wonderful. Well, to kind of set the stage, you note at the beginning of the book that while we provide students and university programs and things like that with numerous tools and strategy and business courses, we rarely talk about how great strategists learn, think, and put ideas together into actual actions. and that there's a deep hole in our understanding of what makes a truly great strategist. Why do you think that is?
Well, we could probably spend the entire hour talking about this, but I think the reality is that our thought processes, they do happen in real time. And we process lots of information, lots of experiences from our past. We also learn that great entrepreneurs are actually focused on the future. So they kind of live in the future, which is gets into the subject of vision. And some of them don't make it, but there's a lot of complexity that goes into their thought processes. But when business school professors or business journalists write about these stories, they're basically writing about them in hindsight, and everything
Mm-hmm.
seems simpler in hindsight. And we've simplified things for this book as well, but most of that hindsight doesn't really get into the complexity, the tensions, the chances people take, the way serendipity plays a role. It's so strategy is much messier and much more complicated than we generally teach in, say, an MBA class, because we don't have time really to go through all the details. You can't expect MBA students to read a 400-page book or to read 10 books on Bill Gates's thinking and career for one class discussing Microsoft. So everything gets synthesized into these little cases or little lectures. So what we've tried to do in this book is simplify. That's why we have these rules or principles that we think were kind of at the high level of how they thought, or at least eventually how the three of them came to think. But in the book, we go through the messy complexities of many of the examples of how they got to where they were.
I think that is helpful because certainly, when we storytell with hindsight, we smooth over the rough edges, and it's hard to fully remember sort of the fog.
The real wisdom is in the stories. I
Mm-hmm.
listened to your podcast on Pixar, actually, just to get a sense of what your Pixar is, and all those details. It would never be in an MBA class lecture, right? Exactly what was going through Steve Jobs's mind and the people he was conversing with and how they processed all that information and the risks he took and didn't take and all that thing. So we tried to capture some of it, but still, if you're going to teach students how to think strategically, you do have to condense these ideas into some high level principles or heuristics. And so, and you want to illustrate those with stories. So that's what we tried to do in this book, and briefly too. For a book on three people, it's really quite short.
But a good read, a good read. Well, with that, I think you've set the stage nicely. Let's go through those 5 rules. Rule 1: look forward, reason back.
Well, I'll tell you another story about the origin of the book. So David had called me up, said we should write this book, and so we met. We got together and met. We ended up meeting roughly twice a month to work on the book for the next year, let's say. But on that first day, we sat down and tried to come up with a list of principles. We were calling them principles at the time. I had
Mm-hmm.
written a book called Microsoft Secrets back in 1995, which is about the principles that Microsoft had used. I think we had a dozen. And then David and I did another book, Competing on Internet Time, in 1998, which was about Netscape versus Microsoft. And that we also organized by principles. Another book I did on platform leadership, I organized by principles. So principles is the way we thought about it. By the way, our publisher didn't like the word principles and made us use the word rule.
I was going to ask if that influenced publishers.
So okay, all right. Principles sound a little bit academic, but we were looking for these high level ideas that motivated their thinking and the positions they took, the risks they took, the bets they made, and things they avoided. So on that first day, we actually came up with all 5 of the rules that you see in the book. And pretty much, and we argued about each of them, but by the end of that, we spent maybe 2 hours But it was very clear to us, and David and I, again, know these three people or knew them very well, had studied them closely, worked with them for 25 years, their companies. And so it was quite clear. So the very first one was look forward, reason back. And the very point was that we were both struck by the fact that they were focused on the future. They saw something, and the critical thing they all saw was the impact of Moore's law, that number of transistors on a piece of silicon was doubling every year and a half or so. And if you extrapolated that data into the future, which Gordon Moore, the co-founder and CEO of Intel, had done, you're going to get incredible computing power. So to Bill, looking at the future, he's saying, well, the end state of that is going to be computers are everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to need software. I'm a software guy. He had two software companies in high school. So I said, I'm going to create a software company. I'm going to productize that software. And in other words, you write it once, sell it a million times, and write software for other people to write software. And that kind of became a platform kind of idea. Bill saw this. So that's what Bill saw he was a software guy. Steve Jobs had exactly the same data, was a member of the Computer Hobbyist Club in California with Steve Wozniak. They were very well aware of Moore's law, made the same extrapolation and said, well, computers are going to be everywhere in the future, so we have to make them as easy to use as a toaster or a consumer appliance. Take it out of the box, put it on a table, and you start using it, or even like a typewriter. So they created Apple, and that vision, the vision was true in both of those two cases, but it led to two very different companies that were very complementary. Andy Grove, by the way, was not. He had an office right next to Gordon Moore, so his job was to execute Moore's law. He had an office right next to Gordon Moore, so he had to execute Moore's law. So he was absolutely convinced that would be true as well, but he was more concerned about what would happen to the industry. And he thought the big computer companies, like vertically integrated computer companies like IBM, would not be able to handle a mass market for this technology. And so you would have new consumer-oriented companies. The industry would fragment into these layers of specialists. And so he decided to quit dealing with the mainframe companies. Their main business at that time was making memory chips for mainframes. He completely quit that business, switched all their factories just to making microprocessors, which was not a commodity and couldn't be easily replicated. And bet on a partnership with Microsoft that they would dominate the operating system layer. So, but the bigger idea is that great strategists or entrepreneur CEOs, they are focused on the future. They have an end state in mind, and then they work back. Okay, if the future is going to be this way in 5 to 10 years, what do I need to do now or in the next 6 months, 6 months after that, to get my company to that end state, or even to get myself to that end state? And so, of course, they were right, but as we also say in the book, they weren't really predicting the future. They were creating that future. And they had the technical skills or the personal abilities to mobilize people around that vision. Other people had that vision too, by the way. And there were many, many people and companies vying to control operating systems and PCs and the market. But they ended up with three of the greatest companies in this space, each the most valuable at a different point in time.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I like the notion of, you think you can see the future, and the odds of that future actually occurring go up if you help create it, if you shape it insofar as you can.
So the idea is you don't really see the future. You have a vision. You understand what is technically possible, and they saw that possibility and worked really hard toward it. And if you've spent any time or even witnessing videos of Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or Andy Grove, you can see just how determined they are, right? Or were. And so these are the kind of people that do shape that future by the decisions they make, right? And we think all leaders do that at one level or another, and at smaller level in their organizations or companies or regions, whatever it happens to be. If it's politics or business or other settings. So we do think that look forward, reason back is a really important part of being a great or an effective leader and strategist or entrepreneur, right?
So Moore's law is something that all these companies rode. You note that at times looking forward into the future can be opportunistic as well.
But the broader principle there too is we say if you look around, there's probably data indicating future trends, whether it's climate change or even in politics or whatever it is. And so part of the job of a leader is to identify those trends, understand that data, understand and extrapolate from that data and understand the implications for them and their organization, and then craft strategy kind of looking forward and reasoning back from that. And by the way, we also use historical. I mean, you also look back, reason forward, and all these guys do that, did that as well. But you can't be trapped in the past, though, right? Strategy, particularly high-tech strategy.
Yeah, when the new world is being created, essentially. So moving a little forward in time from the Pixar case study to when Jobs in 97 came back to Apple, and my studying of it is fascinating. He took a company that was in real financial trouble, had lots of different products, not a very focused product strategy, cut back to 4 products, 2 laptops, 2 desktops, intended at 2 different markets, turned the company around. But even in those early days of coming back to Apple, he was beginning, at least in smaller circles, to articulate that there was a non-computer product in Apple's future, although I don't think he was really putting his finger on that. I find that really interesting because, he'd come up through the computer industry. Next was a computer thing. How hard is it for a strategist to kind of move beyond what maybe they've spent a decade or decades working on into new products, new markets, new visions?
Yeah, of course, that's always hard. In the case of Apple, though, in some ways we say it was easier than it was for Microsoft, or even Intel. Intel and Microsoft kind of found their gold, which was the personal computer and either the Microsoft processor or the operating system and some key applications, and they basically ran with it, and had trouble moving off of it, actually. And Microsoft has done much better job of that than Intel has. But in the case of Apple, and here we get back to a platform story, they had lost the battle for the personal computer, which was a platform story. In other words, the product took on much, if not even most of its value from what third parties were doing with it. In this case, what application developers were doing with it and other kinds of service providers. Whereas Steve was a product guy. He really wanted to control everything in what he delivered to the customer. And he did understand that you need software for a computer, which is why he contracted for it with Microsoft initially. And that's how Microsoft learned to build a graphical user interface. But he wanted to control everything for the customer. But it turned out there were thousands and then millions of applications, and there was no way one company could control it through contracts. And that's where it became a kind of an open platform. When I did my Microsoft Secrets book in 1995, and we noted there were already 5 million applications for Windows 95. Many of them were DOS applications, and they were compatible. They ran on Windows, but the Mac only had a couple hundred. And nobody uses 5 million applications, but that's how you get 1 billion users, because somebody will be using these other applications. Okay, so Steve understood that he had lost that. I think he also understood that a second platform in a mass market platform industry can survive if there's a niche that they exploit and hold. And Apple had found a niche, and that was this extreme ease of use through the user interface. And also there were 2 other derivatives of that. One was educational software, and they started selling Apple devices to primary schools. And then the other turned out to be multimedia because and here this connects Steve to well, the early graphical user interface, but also his experience. By the way, his first job in the tech industry was as a customer support person for Atari video games. And so he absolutely loved graphics, and he eventually bought Pixar, but he wanted to bring graphics to the PC. And so Microsoft was slow to do that because they were mostly concerned with desktop productivity applications. And that's where the bulk of the market was, but there was a little bit of room for desktop publishing and some graphics. And so there was an outside company that really made that work. It was Adobe that came up with a laser printer and some software to control it. And so Apple kind of partnered with Adobe early on. And so they kept the Mac alive. I wrote about this many years ago. My first, and so that third party effect applications or partnership, we call that network effects. It's the external network that brings value to the product. And I had early on published two articles, one in 1987, one in 1992 on VHS versus Betamax development and why Betamax disappeared. It had at one point 90% of the market, but went to zero. And it was all because of the momentum licensing behind the VHS standard, but the fact that third-party producers of pre-recorded tapes eventually abandoned the Betamax because so many companies were able to license VHS, but Sony would not license the Betamax at all. So Apple was the same way, would not license the Mac. So the Mac shrunk down to this niche. But the niche was about 2% of the PC market. It was not actually big enough to support a lot of products. So that's the first thing Steve did when he came back in 1997. He paired, I think they had like 25 or so different variations of products and printers. And he basically threw it all out and said, we're going to focus on two areas, desktop and mobile. By the way, he actually ended up paring back a lot of the desktop and laptop work, although they kept at it. But mobile came to his mind because he kept looking for the next big thing. So the PC is here. We understand the PC. We could shrink the PC down a bit to like a laptop and later on a tablet. But he did have the idea, and you might even say that others had the idea before him, that there would also be handheld devices. If you remember, John Scully, when he was CEO, issued this other kind of clumsy handheld device called a Newton. And we had these PDAs, personal digital assistant devices out there. I had a whole bunch of them. Palm, mine was Palm, and I was on I was an advisory board of one of the companies in the later 1990s using Palm devices, trying to find the right applications. So it was fairly clear that there's going to be something that's going to be a mobile hand device. Actually, Bill Gates saw it too. We have an email from him. We wrote about, he came back from Japan in 1997 saying, I've seen the future in its small screen devices. Japanese are doing all sorts of things with these little computers on your desk and your hand. And he told his guys, I want Windows on the handheld device. And the problem with Microsoft, though, is that the Windows required a lot of processing power. It didn't really have an interface that could be squeezed down to a small screen. And because Apple had lost that PC, desktop, or laptop battle, they could rethink, okay, so then what should the operating system or the user interface for a handheld device look like? And they were able to separate themselves from the PC because they had lost that battle. So what's the next big battle? And Steve was just trying to do enough things to keep the company afloat. And there's lots of stories about this. And again, we can go into all this detail, but Microsoft, was doing fine. They kept Apple afloat, though, Bill, in particular in 1997, by making an investment and settling a lawsuit, bringing a couple $100 million to the company when they were just about out of money. I like to say it's the biggest mistake Bill Gates ever made, because Apple ended up eating their lunch in a whole bunch of areas. But it's a complicated story. We think pressure from antitrust division made Bill worry a bit about if he let Apple go bankrupt, there might be more pressure on him. He was in the middle of being attacked by the Department of Justice. As you probably remember, they actually lost that lawsuit and were almost forced to break up, but they won that on appeal. So I think he was worried about antitrust. But Steve was also a friend of his, and he had a great admiration for the technology that Apple developed, and they had built the first applications for the Macintosh in 1984. And so I don't think he wanted to see Apple disappear. He wanted them to be a small part of the market. They were a good customer too for Office. And if he withdrew Office, then that would have been the end of the Mac. So for a variety of complicated reasons, he kept them alive. But Steve was looking for the next big thing. Microsoft couldn't throw Windows away, but Steve could essentially throw the Macintosh away and say, okay, what's next? So now he made a whole bunch of mistakes there, though. And in retrospect, you don't see the mistakes, but in real time, and as we write about, you do see them. So first, he came up with the iPod as really an accessory to the Macintosh. To populate it with songs, you had to have a Macintosh, and then you download them, and then you connect it to your iPod. And so it did raise sales of the iPod about 1%. I mean, it created a rise in sales for the Macintosh of about 1%. They went from 2 to 3% market share. And it was a pretty good business, but it wasn't really going to salvage the company. And his management team stepped in and overruled him and opened up the iPod to Windows users, which was 97% of the world at that time. And that was against Steve's better judgment. So he, again, product guy, you control everything. You open it up to Windows, you lose control. But
as a result, sales of iPods went
they went through
significantly
the
up.
roof.
Yeah.
And suddenly Apple's making billions of dollars. And so, but it was not Steve's decision. It was against his better judgment. But once he saw what was happening, he said, okay, we're going to make iTunes. This was essentially for iTunes, for the iPod. We're going to make iTunes the best Windows application ever made. So we're going to show those guys what Apple can really do. And you take the iPod, put a touch screen and telephony in it, and then you have the iPhone. Stretch it a little bit, you have the iPad.
Well, let's move to rule 2, make big bets without betting the company. So kind of that balance of making big bets, but try not to make bets that lose everything.
So David Yoffie and I, we argued about this one. The first one was really clear. I look forward to reasoning back. The second one, we were also quite clear that to make a dent in the universe, as Steve liked to say, you had to make a big bet. You can't do everything incrementally. Intel liked to do things incrementally, by the way, but every now and then they'd make a big bet. And Bill Gates liked that. And Steve Jobs liked those big bets, I think, just by personality. But they also knew that the success of their bets had to depend on their organization, and you had to have revenues. You can't go bankrupt. So Bill and Andy were particularly careful that they always had kind of like a plan B, a second revenue stream. And if something went wrong, they had a backup. And Microsoft had a relationship with IBM when they were betting on Windows. That could have really gone badly, but they still had applications. They had Office. I mean, they could have just become an application company. They always had a backup. And Intel had second sourcing and different arrangements, and there was always some other option they could go to. Apple didn't quite work that way. Steve Jobs was kind of all or nothing in many cases, but the fact that he was desperate to keep the company alive made him take some bigger bets, like the iPod. But he still did it in a way that Um, he didn't really believe in plan B, having a plan B or a plan C, but he generally was fairly careful in what he was doing. He really didn't have major failures. And so he thought carefully about what he was doing and what the potential would be. But even more important, as we look carefully at the company, he had a really good team around him. And they made sure that they were covering all the bases strategically. And that led to, of course, the iPod for Windows decision. It led to the App Store, which Steve was also opposed to initially. Um, and um, I think the critical thing was you do what you need to do to keep the company alive.
Mhm.
And you can make your big bet, but you don't want to bet the company where if you're wrong, you fail. So Steve also, when it came down to it, he made a deal with Microsoft and it made a couple deals with Microsoft. And to a lot of the what I call the Apple faithful, that was like doing a deal with the devil. But
Oh, famously had Bill Gates by satellite at the the event where they announced the investment, and people were booing from the crowd.
Steve knew you can't let the company fail. The way they were going to change the future, this is all three of them, was through their organizations.
Mhm,
And so the company has to survive.
mhm.
So anyway, it's so we do say that Steve took biggest bets because he um in some ways you could say he was the most creative and aggressive of all three of those guys. But he also had the least to lose in the end because he had already lost the desktop and go for
Oh,
broke. What's the next big thing?
and I think of the example that you use of, yeah, he opened it up to Windows and iPod sales took off. And I was one of those people. I hadn't used an Apple product since high school and an Apple II.
Yeah.
I bought an iPod. I had iTunes on my Windows machine, but eventually I became an iPhone user and a Macintosh user. So eventually that sort of strategy did work out, but it took a while.
Me too. And actually, iTunes was pretty lousy on Windows, but
I remember it as, yeah, software hairball. But a lot of software didn't work great on
yeah.
Windows, I suppose. Well, let's move to rule 3, build platforms and ecosystems. You've touched on some of this already, but build platforms and ecosystems, not just products. And again, you've done a lot of work on ideas of platforms, and as you indicated earlier, criticized Steve a lot for not having a platform strategy.
So I realized there was a difference between talking about products versus this broader idea of an industry level platform when I was doing this book, Microsoft Secrets, 1995. And so that really is about how Microsoft, with a product that was not as good as the Macintosh, beat the Macintosh because it was a better platform. It was a better foundation for third parties as well as for Microsoft to build applications. And the computer is kind of useless without applications. And so that's really what that story was about. And then there's a lot of other material in that book about the whole development process that dovetailed with that mass market product software as a product approach, which Apple never had to worry about because it basically built products and some software, but Microsoft really got into the mass market. And the value of Windows came from the number of applications. And we saw Bill do things instinctively that reflected that. So, for example, and this is pre-Windows, this goes back to DOS, when IBM came to him to build an operating system. They first didn't want to do it, then they agreed to do it. But when they issued Microsoft DOS, which is the product that actually beat Macintosh, not Windows. Windows wasn't really usable until 1990, but DOS applications and computers had overwhelmed the Mac world because the Mac was difficult to build applications for. But when Steve issued the Mac in 1984, he charged a bundle to application developers. He made them buy a development machine called Lisa and a bunch of software programming tools and databases. it mounted to as much as $20,000 in 1984, which today would be, how much would that be? It would be maybe 4 times that amount. It's a lot of
Yeah.
money for an application software company. When Bill Gates introduced DOS in 1981 and then Windows in later years, he made the software development kit free. And he said, build applications. We're going to build some too, but build your applications and we'll make money by selling copies of Windows or applications that we build ourselves. And so it was a different model. It was not to monetize just simply the operating system, but to build the ecosystem and sell more copies and sell them at a reasonable price, a
Mhm.
reasonable price. And so Bill saw that immediately, and he was reasoning back a little bit on that because he understood that IBM had become a platform in the mainframe industry and it had been cloned, and he thought that would happen in with the PCs as well, and there'd be this huge market. But he also had help. Initially, he didn't want to do the IBM deal, and there was another executive, Kaznishi, a Japanese guy, who said, "You got to do this." And so having that management team around you that could see more broadly than you could see. Bill said, we develop languages. We're not an operating system company. And he was talked out of that by his team. So that's another thing you learn, which, in an MBA strategy class, you would get the high level principles and what happened, but not the details of the debate. And having the right people in the room is absolutely critical. And that's why we always teach that you need people around you who are not just yes people, but who have a different point of view, different backgrounds, who understand customers, technology, economics, whatever it happens to be. In the case of IBM, they like to have people who are physicists and mathematicians and astronomers, and they kind of understand these bigger things. And that's how they get into subjects like quantum computing or even electronic computing. Famous stories about that. But anyway,
Well, that's a great point about who you surround yourself with. So I think Jobs, Gates, and Grove each have a rightful reputation for, at times at least, being really hard on people that they work with. But again, I think maybe the narrative that emerges are some of those stories, but it misses maybe the other side that they liked and needed to have people that would at times be pretty hard on them as well.
but getting back to the platform side, there's many different pieces here, many different ducks you have to line up. If you're just selling a product or a standalone product or standalone service, you don't have to do that. And maybe one person can dominate it. But when you're in a platform business, you've got to line up partners and customers and app developers and service providers. And that's why you need all these different people in the room. And you need them to be honest, and you need to have these open, constructive criticisms. You need to think together. So ultimately, our argument in the book is that Apple was not successful until they learned some of the lessons of what it takes to be a platform company, working with these other parties. And also Microsoft became much more successful as it copied Apple about what does it take to build a great product. I mean, we know from internal memos that Microsoft could not care less about the user interface, except for the fact that Apple was pushing them. And so it's that combination. And Intel was kind of seeing the whole industry evolve and what it took to keep the momentum going at the core, which was the microprocessor. That's what enabled all of these different capabilities. So that's why ultimately computers, smartphones, cloud services, these are all platform businesses, and you have to understand how to play with these other players, cooperate with your competitors, and kind of grow the pie together, which is what these three guys ended up doing. That's why I love the photo on the office wall of Andy Grove. The three of them smiling together. They were in many ways fierce competitors, but they grew the pie together and changed the world together in many ways. And and we're all better off because of it. And they made a lot of money in the process too.
Certainly. Well, skipping to rule 4, exploit leverage and power, play judo and sumo.
Yeah. So this one actually goes back to the 1998 book that David and I wrote called Competing on Internet Time: Lessons from Netscape and the Battle with Microsoft. And we coined the terms judo strategy and sumo strategy in that book. And what we were struck by in that time was the way Netscape was just kind of leveraging the commitments of Microsoft to Windows to play a cross-platform game, build a browser for all different operating systems, for Linux, for the Mac, for DOS, for Windows, and do things that Microsoft would not do if it followed Netscape into the browser wars. And to us, it seemed like it was a judo play. And then when Microsoft stepped in to try to crush Netscape, it was like it was playing sumo. It was threatening not to renew Windows licenses and threatening to withhold this and that, or made huge payments to AOL and other companies, not to load Navigator from Netscape, things like that. So it threw its weight around. Now, a lot of that was found to be in violation of antitrust, but we coined those terms. And so
Mm.
then if we look more broadly at the history of these companies, they've all played judo and sumo at different points in time. When they were small or entering new markets, they would look for leverage points where the bigger competitors in the industry would not follow them, and just gave them a point, and a point of entry. And we do use the example of Apple and the way Steve Jobs handled it, of getting into music. It was a big problem of how do you price digital goods? So what do you price a song at, or what do you price a video file at? And he came up with iTunes. It was not a threat to anybody in the music industry because Apple had basically almost zero share there. And he said, "Oh, look at this as an experiment. We're going to go in here. Maybe we're going to help you guys." And they ended up being the dominant force, basically, in music business. So again, we call that also kind of the puppy dog ploy. You come in, but it was really a kind of judo move. And then eventually they have enormous market power, which they do use. So it's uh, and
Well, I love the story you tell in that context, and I didn't know this one, that at one point very early in that journey, Steve Jobs wanted to buy Universal Music, one of the big publishers, and again, the people around him are kind of like, no, like that'll make the other big publishers our enemies, and that's not how we want to go in. Let's use the puppy dog strategy, to use your word.
right. You buy a publishing company like that, and then you make enemies of all the other music companies. You don't want to be their enemy. You want to be their partner, and bring their music to the PC or to handheld devices in a way that they were not doing it before. So
Mhm.
yeah, the primary logic there was that it's hard to make money in the music business. So his CFO guy said, "You're crazy to do this," and there are other cases of that type of thing. So it was kind of a logic of, you don't want to compete with people that you need, and you want to be their partner, cooperate with them, not compete with them, and also try to stay in the high end of the business where there's money to be made. And this also gets into business models. Microsoft would never go into hardware for the most part, because you want to write a piece of software and sell it a million or a billion times. And that was Bill Gates's model. But as long as Apple was in the high end, they could charge a premium, and they could make money. So lots of these things were
Yeah.
in their thinking. It's not just so simple as the rule we have: exploit leverage and power, play judo and sumo.
Yeah.
Uh,
Rule 5: shape the organization around your personal anchor. What is a personal anchor?
okay, so this was the one rule, and I said before that when David and I sat down, we came up with a list of these 5 things immediately, pretty much immediately, and then we argued about how to word them. The fifth one, we knew what we kind of wanted to say, but didn't know how to say it. I don't even know that we have a good explanation of it now. But the point is that these 3 companies were in many ways extensions of the personalities of these 3 guys. and their personalities were anchored in certain beliefs and skills and weaknesses as well. And when they understood their strengths and their weaknesses and compensated for those weaknesses by the teams they built around them, they were able to become successful CEOs. And the anchor was important because it kept them grounded. So Steve Jobs, for example, his anchor was that user interface. And so no matter what he did, he kept to that anchor. And people around him kept to it, right? If he had bought Universal Studios, that has nothing to do with his personal anchor was making sure you bring technology to the average person through the user interface. And you could do that with products, you could do that with software, but could you do it through a business? Maybe not. Maybe through a business model you could. And so they kept grounded, and the teams around them helped them build out the organization. So their organizations were shaped around their personalities. Now, of course, that comes with strengths and weaknesses too. Microsoft never really got too far beyond the software technology or systems technology base. Apple would push them, but they had a hard time moving off that and this Windows-centric view of the world. At least, well, Gates was in charge, or the guys that he had hired were in charge. And they needed to get to another executive who grew up in a whole different worldview, the open internet, cloud services, Satya Nadella, before they could more fully embrace other approaches to other business models and selling packaged software and everything revolving around Windows. But so that's why, and Intel too was so dominated by the discipline of Andy Grove that they found it hard to stray too far from the microprocessor, from the x86 PC compatible microprocessor. They had opportunities to buy Cisco. They had opportunities to buy ARM. They had all sorts of things that they could have been doing that could have moved them into the mobile cloud world a little bit more easily. Although they still do have a big presence in servers, but graphical processing units, things like that. I mean, that's where all the action is today around AI. Intel kind of missed that, and they missed a lot of things. And you can blame the success. You can blame that on Andy Grove's kind of disciplined, relatively narrow vision. Stay close to what you know how to do. So the challenge, though, if you shape the organization around your personal anchor, and your anchor keeps you anchored, right?
Yeah.
It keeps you from moving too far away.
Sometimes you need to pull up anchor and move.
Sometimes you need to pull up anchor or cut the cord. And so that's why even though this is actually one of my favorite chapters, because it really gets into the nitty gritty of how they ran these companies, but it's and build their teams and infuse their particular discipline. We have anecdotes like Steve Jobs would get obsessed about how a particular pixel was designed on an icon, and he would rant and rave and spend time on that. And you'd ask, why would the CEO be so concerned with the design of, a few pixels on an icon on a screen? He said, well, because I notice it's wrong, and the customer will notice it too. And everything should be consistent and in this easy to use, elegant mode. But Steve did that not because he wanted to fix the pixel, but because he wanted to teach the people around him what discipline was and what their focus should be. And that you had to get things right, and you can't just be sloppy about something. Everything has to be.
And that remains to this day. I keep some boxes from my MacBooks and iPads that I've had in my office, because when I have a student that I think is struggling with some design issues, it's an extreme example, but I say, just open this box. And it's so well put together, and it's a good experience just to open the box and that whole vibe, if you will. Yeah.
It's that elegance and consistency of everything that is the extension of Steve Jobs' personality into that company, even today, in everything they do, even though Steve is gone. And the same thing with Microsoft in many ways, and the same thing with Intel in many ways. And Intel is still trying to find their way forward now, because in many ways they were too narrow. Andy Grove, actually, Andy was pretty broad, but his successors were pretty narrow. And so I like to think that if Andy had remained in charge and healthy, they would have found ways to go forward into the future. But Andy was not an entrepreneur, actually. He was a manager, an excellent manager. But you need entrepreneurs around too. You need people who can see the next big thing and push forward and invest in it. Andy was a bit reluctant to make some big investments outside of what Intel understood.
Well, and I think another entrepreneur in that space, Morris Chang, went
Yeah, an
to
MIT graduate.
went to Taiwan, but he understood that there are people out there that would like to design processors and microchips and not have to build a fab. And what would happen if we could provide that service? And I think that's what we've seen. So another entrepreneur kind of entering that space and making life pretty hard for Intel.
Intel had a pretty good business model for about 30 or 40 years, though.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
how long should a run last, though?
Yeah.
But at some point, you do need to make a transition. And that's where the look forward, reason back comes in. So they stopped kind of looking forward and got a bit trapped in what they were doing in the present, I think. And that's why, but the five rules, they're principles, they work together. None of them really by itself can really define success.
Well, you've mentioned it before that you at one point were a critic of Steve Jobs for lacking a platform strategy, but eventually they came to that. I at a talk that I saw that Jim Collins gave, and he too was a friend of Steve Jobs, but it was after Jobs had passed away. He described Jobs as kind of his first stint at Apple as Steve Jobs 1.0. Steve Jobs 2.0 is after he came back up until he passed away. And then he said, it's just a shame because after he'd been in his 50s when he passed away that we don't get to see what Steve Jobs 3.0 would have been. But I just like that emphasis, not just on Jobs, but on any one of us, on learning, reassessing, getting better. How do you think about these rules and kind of that evolution and learning and becoming a better leader and a better strategist?
Well, we think these rules are general enough that they apply to any generation at any time. And we actually end the book by looking at the next generation of people, of Mark Zuckerberg and well, we even talked a little bit about Elon Musk, actually, and however you feel about him personally, he's very much a look forward, reason back kind of guy. And his anchor is actually physics. He understands what is physically possible. He also thinks through the economics, and then he has an idea of what is possible, and then he reasons back to, okay, today I'm going to start building a reusable rocket or an electric vehicle because I know it's going to be possible as we go down the road. And so he embodies that, and he's built an organization. He could do and his organization is an extension of himself.
It's not much more future oriented than thinking about colonizing Mars, is it?
Yeah, I mean, he's going to die orbiting Mars, probably not even landing on it. But and Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, they're all, Mark Andreessen of Netscape, they all, I think, follow these kinds of rules in very, very similar ways. That's why we think these are really broader, timeless. The one you need to be most careful about is shaping the organization. I think our personal anchors are kind of narrow, and they become the organizational anchor, and there has to be some flexibility, and then there has to be a way to move forward, to move beyond the founder or the dominant executive. And I think most companies struggle with that succession. And I've been on a whole bunch of boards. I'm on one now, and we're struggling with the issue of succession. And I also just stepped down as deputy dean and had to train my successor. So in in my setting, but we don't have a dean though. We're searching for a new dean. So
Makes it particularly a challenge.
yeah, right. So every organization goes through this challenge, and so you get so wrapped up in kind of winning in the present, or um, and preparing for the future that you can see. But it's another job of executives, as we've learned, to prepare the organization for when you will not be there. And I still haven't found a company that did a really good job of it. It there usually needs to be some kind of a transition period. So Apple, and we write about this a little bit, but Tim Cook has done a great job in the transition period. But it still seems like Apple is in a transition period. They're still kind of building off what Steve Jobs had done in this incredible decade when they came up with the iPhone and iTunes and the iPod before that, then the iPad, and that whole set of or portfolio of products. They're still building derivative versions of it now. Microsoft has finally moved beyond Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer. Took them a while to do it. Intel is now, they just announced they're going to lay off, I think, 15,000 people. They're losing tons of money these days. They haven't found the next big thing. They're being eclipsed. But you still need their product, by the way. Um, and they just have to figure out how to go forward. And they've had a lot of opportunities for acquisitions and partnerships, and they haven't really taken advantage of them over the years, over the decades. So that's the next great challenge. We don't have a principle for that, or we don't have a rule for that. Maybe that should have been another rule.
Or perhaps another book.
Perhaps. There's lots of books to write yet.
There are. Well, Michael, thank you for being with us. Again, enjoyed when you lectured about kind of these 5 rules the first time I saw it, and then read the book, and I've enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you, Kevin. I've enjoyed it myself immensely. I have to go back to that book, though, and reread some of the end.
It's been a while.